Why the flesh fears obedience to the Spirit. There is a war that does not announce itself with noise, blood, or visible enemies. It does not march with banners, nor does it demand your attention with spectacle. Yet it is the most decisive battle a believer will ever face. This war unfolds in silence, inside the human heart, in the invisible space where desire meets conviction, where impulse clashes with truth, and where the flesh confronts the authority of the Spirit. Many believers sense this conflict daily, but lack the language to define it. They feel resistance when they attempt to pray, hesitation when obedience requires sacrifice, and discomfort when truth challenges their habits. This resistance is not random. It is the flesh responding to a threat. The flesh fears obedience to the Spirit because obedience represents the end of control. When the Spirit leads, the flesh no longer decides what feels good, what is convenient, or what preserves comfort. Obedience strips the flesh of its illusion of sovereignty. It exposes the truth that the flesh was never meant to rule, only to submit. This is why obedience feels heavy before it feels freeing. The flesh interprets submission as loss, even though the Spirit knows it as life. Throughout history, every genuine spiritual awakening has been preceded by an internal struggle. Before transformation, there is tension. Before clarity, there is resistance. Before freedom, there is fear. The flesh resists not because obedience is harmful, but because obedience dismantles the systems the flesh relies on to survive: pride, indulgence, distraction, self-rule, and compromise. The flesh thrives in ambiguity, but the Spirit demands alignment. The flesh feeds on delay, but the Spirit calls for decision. The flesh prefers negotiation, but the Spirit speaks in absolutes. This message is not about condemning the body or denying human experience. It is about exposing a spiritual reality that every believer must confront if they desire to walk in truth rather than illusion. The fear of obedience is not a moral weakness. It is a spiritual signal. It reveals where authority is being challenged. When the Spirit calls and the flesh trembles, it is because a shift in power is being demanded. In this teaching, we will uncover why the flesh reacts so strongly to spiritual obedience, how this fear manifests in subtle ways, and what it truly costs to surrender control to the Spirit. This is not a surface-level conversation. It is an invitation to look honestly at the inner resistance that keeps many believers spiritually stagnant while outwardly faithful. If you have ever wondered why obedience feels difficult, even when you love God, this message is for you. Obedience threatens the flesh's illusion of control. The flesh fears obedience to the Spirit because obedience exposes a fundamental lie the flesh depends on: the belief that it is in control. From the moment a human becomes self-aware, the flesh begins constructing systems to maintain autonomy. These systems are not always sinful on the surface. They often appear as personal preferences, comfort zones, routines, emotional patterns, and rational justifications. Over time, these structures become deeply embedded, forming a false sense of governance over one's life. Obedience to the Spirit threatens to dismantle these structures entirely. Control is the currency of the flesh. It does not merely want pleasure. It wants authority over decision-making. The flesh wants the final say in how time is spent, how emotions are expressed, how boundaries are set, and how truth is interpreted. When the Spirit calls for obedience, it does not ask for partial influence. It demands alignment. This demand feels invasive to the flesh because it exposes how fragile its control actually is. The flesh survives by negotiating. It prefers compromise over surrender. It tells the believer that obedience can wait, that conviction can be softened, that urgency is unnecessary. It reframes obedience as extremism and discipline as legalism. These narratives are not accidental. They are defense mechanisms. The flesh knows that once obedience becomes immediate and unconditional, its power diminishes rapidly. This is why many believers experience sudden internal resistance when they are close to obeying a spiritual directive. The resistance may appear as fatigue, distraction, doubt, or emotional unrest. These sensations are not always external attacks. Often they are internal reactions. The flesh senses that obedience will result in loss of dominance. It fears exposure because obedience reveals who has truly been leading. Obedience to the Spirit also threatens predictability. The flesh relies on patterns it can anticipate. It feels safe in familiar cycles, even destructive ones, because familiarity creates the illusion of stability. The Spirit, however, often leads into unfamiliar territory. Obedience may require forgiveness where resentment feels justified, restraint where indulgence feels natural, silence where self-expression feels necessary, or patience where urgency feels demanded. Each of these acts removes a layer of fleshly control. The flesh interprets unpredictability as danger. This is why obedience often feels risky, even when it aligns with truth. The flesh asks, "What will happen if I obey?" Not because obedience is wrong, but because the flesh cannot calculate outcomes when it is not in charge. The Spirit does not negotiate outcomes, it calls for trust. Trust is threatening to the flesh because trust transfers authority. Another reason obedience terrifies the flesh is because obedience dismantles identity structures built on self-rule. Many people unconsciously define themselves by their independence, preferences, and emotional reactions. Obedience reframes identity around submission and alignment rather than self-expression. The flesh resists this shift because it feels like erasure, when in reality it is refinement. When the Spirit leads, excuses lose their power. Rationalizations collapse. The flesh can no longer hide behind complexity or emotional justification. Obedience simplifies the spiritual path, and simplicity is dangerous to the flesh because it removes room for manipulation. The Spirit does not overwhelm, it clarifies, and clarity leaves no place for the flesh to hide. The fear of obedience is also intensified because obedience accelerates transformation. The flesh thrives in slow change. It tolerates gradual improvement because it allows time to adapt and renegotiate control. Obedience, however, produces decisive shifts. It breaks cycles instead of managing them. It exposes patterns instead of accommodating them. The flesh fears speed because speed reduces resistance windows. This is why delayed obedience feels comfortable, while immediate obedience feels threatening. Delay gives the flesh time to regain footing. Immediate obedience catches it unprepared. The Spirit often calls for prompt action not to test loyalty, but to bypass the flesh's defense systems. The longer obedience is postponed, the stronger the internal resistance becomes. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience invites accountability. When the Spirit leads, responsibility can no longer be outsourced to circumstances, people, or emotions. The believer must confront their choices honestly. This confrontation feels heavy to the flesh, which prefers ambiguity and blame-shifting. Obedience demands ownership. At its core, the flesh fears obedience because obedience reveals truth, and truth dismantles illusion. The illusion of control is comforting but false. The Spirit does not seek to humiliate the flesh, but to restore proper order. When the Spirit leads and the flesh follows, peace replaces tension. But before peace emerges, the flesh must relinquish control, and that moment of surrender is where fear peaks. If you feel resistance when obedience is required, do not assume failure. Resistance is often evidence that obedience is necessary. The discomfort you feel is not proof that you are off track. It is proof that a shift in authority is taking place. The flesh fears obedience because obedience ends its reign. If this message is speaking to your inner struggle and helping you understand the resistance you feel when the Spirit calls you higher, subscribe to the channel so you can continue this journey of clarity, discipline, and spiritual growth. The flesh fears obedience to the Spirit because obedience dismantles the pleasure-based operating system by which the flesh survives. While control is the flesh's throne, pleasure is its fuel. The flesh does not merely seek enjoyment in obvious or crude forms. It organizes life around comfort, emotional gratification, validation, and relief from discomfort. Obedience to the Spirit directly interferes with this system, not by forbidding joy, but by redefining its source. This redefinition feels like a threat because the flesh equates pleasure with life itself. From the flesh's perspective, pleasure is evidence that something is good, safe, or worthwhile. Pain, restraint, delay, or discipline are interpreted as danger signals. The Spirit, however, operates on an entirely different axis. The Spirit measures truth, alignment, and purpose, not immediate sensation. This divergence creates tension because obedience often requires choosing what is right over what feels good in the moment. The flesh interprets this choice as self-denial in the worst sense, as if obedience were an act of violence against the self. This is why obedience is often accompanied by internal protest. The flesh asks why something that feels restrictive should be good, why restraint should be holy, and why discipline should lead to life. These questions are not intellectual, they are defensive. The flesh has learned to trust sensation more than truth. Over time, it has been conditioned to associate pleasure with safety and discomfort with threat. Obedience disrupts this conditioning. The fear intensifies because obedience exposes how deeply the flesh has intertwined identity with gratification. Many people do not merely enjoy certain behaviors, habits, or emotional patterns. They see them as part of who they are. When obedience calls for change, the flesh hears annihilation. It says, "If I cannot have this, who am I?" This is not a rational fear, but it is a powerful one. The flesh believes that without its familiar pleasures, it will lose coherence. Obedience also interrupts emotional dependency. The flesh uses emotions as regulators, seeking pleasure to soothe anxiety, distraction to escape discomfort, and indulgence to manage stress. These coping mechanisms become normalized, even spiritualized. The flesh convinces the believer that they deserve relief, that indulgence is self-care, and that restraint is harmful. Obedience, however, exposes these narratives. It reveals that many pleasures are not restorative, but anesthetic. This exposure is deeply unsettling. The flesh fears being left without its numbing agents. It fears silence because silence removes stimulation. It fears patience because patience delays reward. It fears discipline because discipline trains desire rather than obeying it. Obedience challenges the flesh to sit with discomfort without immediately resolving it through pleasure. To the flesh, this feels unbearable. Another reason obedience threatens the flesh is that obedience retrains desire itself. The flesh does not simply want pleasure, it wants to define what is desirable. Over time, repeated indulgence shapes longing. What once was optional becomes necessary. Obedience interrupts this process by refusing to obey every craving. It creates space between impulse and action. In that space, the flesh loses power. This loss of power is terrifying because the flesh relies on immediacy. It thrives when desire is instantly gratified. Obedience introduces delay, and delay exposes dependency. When gratification is postponed, cravings intensify before they weaken. The flesh interprets this intensification as proof that obedience is harmful. In reality, it is proof that dependency is being broken. The Spirit does not oppose pleasure, it opposes enslavement. True joy, as understood spiritually, is not reactive or fragile. It is stable, deep, and independent of circumstance. The flesh cannot comprehend this because its pleasures are conditional. They require stimulation, novelty, and repetition. Obedience threatens to replace these shallow pleasures with something less predictable, but far more sustaining. To the flesh, this feels like starvation. This fear is amplified by memory. The flesh remembers past moments of pleasure vividly and uses them as evidence against obedience. It replays sensations, emotions, and relief associated with indulgence. It rarely replays the emptiness, regret, or diminishing returns that followed. Obedience calls the believer to see the full picture, not just the highlight reel. The flesh resists this honesty. Obedience also exposes how pleasure has been used as a reward system for avoiding growth. The flesh often tolerates spiritual language as long as it does not interfere with habits. It accepts beliefs without behavior change. Obedience disrupts this arrangement. It demands alignment between belief and action. When pleasure must be surrendered or reordered, the flesh panics because its loopholes are closing. The fear becomes even more intense when obedience threatens socially reinforced pleasures. Many indulgences are normalized, celebrated, and even encouraged by culture. When obedience requires stepping away from these patterns, the flesh fears isolation and judgment. It equates belonging with participation. Obedience, however, prioritizes integrity over acceptance. This choice feels costly to the flesh because it risks loneliness. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience reveals how temporary its pleasures are. When indulgence is removed, the believer is forced to confront underlying emptiness, unresolved wounds, and unmet needs. The flesh would rather maintain surface satisfaction than face deep healing. Obedience insists on healing rather than masking. Healing is painful before it is liberating. Another layer of fear arises because obedience dismantles entitlement. The flesh believes it has earned pleasure through effort, suffering, or self-perceived goodness. Obedience challenges this transactional mindset. It teaches that life is not about compensation, but alignment. The flesh resents this because entitlement justifies indulgence. Obedience removes that justification. The flesh's fear is not entirely conscious. Often it manifests as vague unease, irritability, or resistance without clear reason. The believer may say they want to obey, but feel inexplicably heavy when doing so. This heaviness is not a sign of wrong direction. It is the flesh grieving the loss of dominance. Obedience is forcing it to relinquish a system it has relied on for survival. Over time, however, something remarkable happens. As obedience continues, the intensity of fear diminishes. The pleasures the flesh once clung to lose their grip. New desires form. Joy becomes less reactive and more grounded. Peace emerges not from stimulation, but from alignment. The flesh begins to learn that obedience does not destroy pleasure. It purifies it, but this learning only happens through persistence. The flesh will test obedience repeatedly, offering substitutes, distractions, and rationalizations. It will claim obedience is excessive, unnecessary, or harmful. These claims should not be feared. They are signs that transformation is underway. If you are experiencing discomfort around obedience, especially when it challenges your habits, pleasures, or emotional coping mechanisms, understand that this discomfort is not punishment. It is withdrawal from dependency. It is the nervous system of the flesh adjusting to a new authority. Stay with the process. Obedience does not lead to deprivation. It leads to freedom. But freedom does not feel safe to the flesh at first. The flesh fears obedience because obedience ends its pleasure monopoly. It introduces a joy that cannot be controlled, predicted, or exploited, and that kind of joy requires surrender. If this teaching is helping you understand why obedience feels threatening and why your inner resistance is not random, subscribe to the channel to continue walking deeper into clarity, discipline, and spiritual maturity. The flesh fears obedience to the Spirit because obedience exposes truth, and truth dismantles the narratives the flesh uses to justify its existence. The flesh does not survive merely by desire or habit. It survives by stories. These stories are internal explanations that make disobedience feel reasonable, delay feel wise, compromise feel mature, and resistance feel justified. Over time, these narratives become so familiar that they are mistaken for wisdom, personality, or even discernment. Obedience to the Spirit threatens these narratives because obedience does not argue, explain, or negotiate. It simply reveals. The flesh depends on interpretation. It wants the power to reinterpret conviction until conviction loses urgency. When the Spirit speaks clearly, the flesh responds by adding complexity. It introduces nuance where clarity was given. It raises questions not to seek truth, but to dilute it. Obedience ends this process. When a believer obeys, the inner debate collapses. The flesh fears this collapse because debate is how it delays accountability. One of the most powerful narratives the flesh uses is the story of not yet. Not yet the right time, not yet enough clarity, not yet enough strength, not yet enough confirmation. This story feels reasonable because it does not deny obedience outright. It only postpones it. The flesh knows that postponed obedience often becomes abandoned obedience. The Spirit, however, does not operate on vague timelines. When the Spirit convicts, the moment matters. Obedience honors timing. Delay dishonors it. The flesh fears obedience because obedience exposes how often waiting is actually avoidance. When obedience finally happens, the believer often realizes that the feared consequences never materialize. What does materialize is peace, clarity, and alignment. This realization is devastating to the flesh because it proves that its warnings were exaggerated or false. Obedience unmasks the flesh as an unreliable narrator. Another narrative the flesh depends on is self-protection. The flesh frames disobedience as wisdom by claiming it is guarding emotional safety, relational stability, or personal well-being. It says obedience will lead to loss, rejection, or pain. These warnings feel convincing because they appeal to vulnerability. But obedience reveals a deeper truth. Many of these protections are actually prisons. They keep the believer safe from pain, but also safe from growth. The flesh fears obedience because obedience forces confrontation with fear itself. Fear thrives in anticipation, not reality. The flesh builds entire systems around avoiding feared outcomes. Obedience moves the believer through fear rather than around it. When fear is faced and survived, its power diminishes. The flesh does not want fear exposed as survivable. It wants fear to remain authoritative. Obedience also threatens the flesh because obedience exposes hypocrisy, not in a condemning way, but in a clarifying one. Many believers sincerely love truth, but selectively apply it. The flesh helps manage this inconsistency by compartmentalizing life. Certain areas are surrendered, others are protected. Obedience does not respect these compartments. It reveals that partial surrender is still resistance. This revelation is uncomfortable because it challenges self-image. The flesh invests heavily in identity preservation. It wants the believer to see themselves as faithful, wise, and spiritually mature, even when areas of resistance remain untouched. Obedience forces alignment between identity and behavior. It removes the comfort of believing one thing while living another. The flesh fears this exposure because it destabilizes false confidence. Another reason the flesh fears obedience is that obedience reveals the cost of self-deception. Many patterns persist, not because the believer lacks knowledge, but because they have learned how to look away. The flesh assists in this avoidance by minimizing conviction and amplifying distraction. Obedience interrupts distraction. It brings attention back to what has been avoided. Attention is dangerous to the flesh because attention leads to action. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience exposes misplaced loyalties. Often resistance to obedience is not about the act itself, but about what the act threatens to disrupt. Relationships, routines, reputations, and comforts can quietly become higher authorities than the spirit. The flesh protects these loyalties by framing obedience as unnecessary or extreme. When obedience happens, the hierarchy is revealed. The spirit is restored to first place, and the flesh loses leverage. Truth revealed through obedience also exposes emotional dependencies. The flesh often bonds identity to approval, validation, or belonging. Obedience sometimes requires choosing truth over harmony, integrity over acceptance. The flesh fears this choice because it threatens attachment. It equates disapproval with danger. Obedience teaches the believer that peace rooted in alignment is more stable than peace rooted in approval. The flesh also relies on the narrative of complexity. It insists that situations are too complicated for simple obedience. It argues that circumstances require exceptions, adjustments, and reinterpretations. While wisdom does consider context, the flesh abuses complexity to avoid surrender. Obedience simplifies. It does not deny complexity, but it refuses to let complexity override truth. This simplification feels threatening because it removes the believer's ability to hide behind analysis. The flesh prefers thinking over acting, discussing over doing, learning over obeying. Obedience bypasses endless contemplation. It turns knowledge into responsibility. The flesh fears responsibility because responsibility removes excuses. Another deep fear arises because obedience exposes powerlessness. The flesh likes to believe that change happens through effort alone. Obedience teaches dependence. It requires trusting the Spirit to sustain what obedience initiates. This dependence feels humiliating to the flesh, which values self-sufficiency. Obedience reveals that transformation is not self-engineered. It is Spirit-led. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience exposes how often resistance is emotional rather than logical. When obedience finally happens, the believer often realizes that their objections were rooted in fear, pride, or attachment, not reason. This realization dismantles self-justification. The flesh loses credibility. Over time, obedience reshapes perception. What once felt threatening begins to feel natural. What once felt restrictive begins to feel freeing. This shift terrifies the flesh because it proves that fear was never a reliable guide. Obedience recalibrates the believer's internal compass. Desire begins to align with truth. Resistance weakens. The flesh resists this recalibration fiercely because it knows that once truth becomes desirable, its influence will fade. Obedience is not a single event, it is a pattern. Each act of obedience strengthens discernment and weakens deception. The flesh cannot survive long in an environment of clarity. This is why the flesh intensifies its resistance when obedience is repeated. It may escalate fear, confusion, or emotional turmoil. These reactions are not signs of failure. They are signs that the old narratives are losing power. The flesh is fighting to maintain relevance. If you are walking through a season where obedience is exposing uncomfortable truths about your motivations, fears, or attachments, understand that this exposure is not condemnation. It is liberation. The Spirit reveals truth not to shame, but to heal. The flesh fears obedience because obedience reveals what must change. Stay faithful in obedience even when clarity costs comfort. Truth will steady you, alignment will strengthen you, and what the flesh fears most will become the source of your freedom. If this message is helping you recognize the hidden narratives that resist the spirit within you and is giving language to the inner battle you face, subscribe to the channel so you can continue growing in truth, obedience, and spiritual maturity. The flesh fears obedience to the spirit because obedience dismantles the ego's need to be self-defined, self-directed, and self-protected. At its deepest level, the flesh is not merely a collection of desires or habits. It is an identity system built around autonomy. It wants to decide who you are, how you are seen, and what you are worth. Obedience to the spirit directly threatens this system because it relocates identity from self-authorship to divine alignment. The flesh interprets this relocation as erasure, even though it is actually restoration. From early life, the flesh learns to construct identity through comparison, achievement, pain, survival, and control. Experiences shape self-perception. Success creates pride, failure creates defense, rejection creates masks, and affirmation creates dependence. Over time, these layers form an ego that feels fragile, yet fiercely defended. Obedience challenges this entire structure by asserting that identity is not something to be built, protected, or proven, but something to be received. The flesh resists this because receiving requires humility, and humility dissolves ego-based power. The flesh wants to be the author of meaning. It wants to interpret experiences through self-interest, emotional preference, and personal narrative. Obedience interrupts this authorship. When the spirit leads, meaning is no longer negotiable. The believer is no longer free to define truth according to comfort or convenience. This loss of interpretive authority feels suffocating to the flesh because it has relied on self-definition for survival. This is why obedience often triggers internal identity panic. The flesh asks, if I obey, who will I become? Not because obedience destroys identity, but because it threatens the false identities that have been carefully constructed. Many believers unconsciously cling to roles shaped by pain, such as the strong one, the independent one, the misunderstood one, the self-reliant one, or the one who never needs help. Obedience exposes these roles as coping mechanisms rather than callings. The flesh fears obedience because obedience dismantles these protective identities. When the spirit leads, you may be called to vulnerability, where strength was used as armor, dependence where independence was a shield, silence where self-expression was validation, or submission where control was security. Each of these moments feels like a threat to the ego because the ego equates identity with survival. Obedience says survival is not the goal, alignment is. Another layer of fear arises because obedience removes the right to self-justify. The ego thrives on explanation. It wants to explain why it reacts, why it resists, why it delays. These explanations protect self-image. Obedience bypasses explanation. It does not ask whether resistance is understandable. It asks whether alignment is required. This shift is deeply unsettling to the flesh because it removes the safety net of rationalization. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience exposes pride in subtle forms. Pride is not always loud or arrogant. Often it appears as self-sufficiency, emotional independence, or the belief that one's discernment is superior. Obedience confronts these forms of pride gently but firmly. It reminds the believer that wisdom flows from submission, not from self-assurance. The flesh resents this reminder because pride has become intertwined with dignity. This resentment intensifies when obedience requires submission to something unseen or unprovable by logic alone. The flesh prefers evidence it can measure, control, or predict. Obedience requires trust beyond sensory confirmation. This feels humiliating to the ego because it admits limitation. The flesh would rather appear wise than be aligned. Obedience values alignment over appearance. Another reason the flesh fears obedience is that obedience dismantles performance-based worth. Many believers unknowingly relate to God through achievement, discipline, or spiritual productivity. The flesh supports this system because it allows control. If worth can be earned, it can also be protected. Obedience threatens this transactional relationship. It teaches that worth is not negotiated, it is granted. This truth destabilizes the ego's bargaining power. The flesh fears losing leverage. When worth is unconditional, the ego cannot manipulate behavior to secure approval. Obedience removes the illusion that spirituality is a negotiation. It reveals that obedience flows from identity, not toward it. This reversal is deeply uncomfortable because it removes the ego's ability to feel superior through effort. Obedience also threatens the flesh because obedience dismantles comparison. The ego constantly measures itself against others to determine value. It looks for affirmation through distinction. Obedience shifts focus away from others entirely. It calls for faithfulness rather than visibility. This shift feels like obscurity to the flesh. The ego fears becoming unseen, irrelevant, or ordinary. But obedience teaches that significance is not measured by recognition. It is measured by alignment. The flesh resists this because it has learned to equate attention with value. When obedience calls for hidden faithfulness, quiet consistency, or unseen sacrifice, the ego protests. It fears disappearing. In reality, obedience is not erasure, it is grounding. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience exposes the exhaustion of self-maintenance. Maintaining ego-based identity requires constant effort, managing perception, defending boundaries, proving worth, avoiding weakness. Obedience invites rest by transferring responsibility. The Spirit does not ask the believer to maintain identity, only to abide in it. The flesh resists rest because rest removes its function. This resistance often appears as anxiety when obedience requires letting go. The flesh equates letting go with losing control. It does not trust that identity will remain intact without effort. Obedience teaches that what is real does not require protection. What is false does. This realization is destabilizing because it forces the flesh to confront how much energy has been spent preserving illusions. Another fear emerges because obedience reveals how often ego has been mistaken for intuition. The flesh learns to label emotional impulses as discernment. Obedience tests these impulses. When obedience contradicts emotional preference, the flesh feels invalidated. It resents this correction. The ego does not like to be told it is unreliable. Yet obedience does not shame intuition. It refines it. Over time, obedience aligns emotional perception with truth. But before this alignment occurs, the flesh experiences disorientation. What once felt certain now feels questionable. This uncertainty is frightening because it removes the ego's confidence. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience exposes resistance as attachment. Many internal struggles are not battles against evil, but against loss. Loss of comfort, loss of image, loss of control, loss of narrative. Obedience reveals that much of what is being protected is not essential. This revelation threatens the ego's sense of necessity. As obedience continues, something profound happens. The ego begins to soften. Identity becomes less reactive. Self-definition becomes less rigid. The believer experiences freedom not because identity is lost, but because it is no longer defended. The flesh fears this state because it cannot operate without defense. Obedience removes the battlefield the ego relies on to exist. This is why obedience often feels like dying before it feels like living. The flesh interprets surrender as annihilation, but what is actually dying is false selfhood. What is emerging is something more stable, more grounded, and less afraid. Obedience does not erase the self. It reveals the self that no longer needs to fight for relevance. If you are experiencing resistance because obedience feels like it threatens who you are, understand that this fear is not a warning. It is a signal that transformation is near. The flesh fears obedience because obedience liberates identity from ego-based survival. Remain faithful. Do not retreat when obedience feels like loss. What you are losing is not yourself. It is the burden of pretending to be your own source. If this message is helping you understand why obedience feels like an identity crisis and why your inner resistance runs so deep, subscribe to the channel so you can continue this journey toward true freedom, grounded identity, and spirit-led life. The flesh fears obedience to the spirit because obedience leads inevitably to death of the old self, and the flesh's deepest instinct is self-preservation. Beyond control, pleasure, narrative, and ego, there is a final reason obedience provokes such intense inner resistance. Obedience dismantles the very version of life the flesh believes it must protect to survive. The flesh does not understand transformation. It only understands continuation. Anything that signals an ending feels like extinction. Obedience is feared because obedience marks the beginning of an ending. At the core of the flesh's fear is the terror of losing familiarity. The flesh is deeply attached to what is known, even when what is known is painful, limiting, or destructive. Familiar suffering feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. Patterns, even harmful ones, provide predictability. Predictability gives the illusion of control, and control gives the illusion of safety. Obedience disrupts this entire structure. It introduces change not as a suggestion, but as a requirement. The flesh interprets obedience as a threat, because obedience demands surrender without full visibility. The spirit does not lay out every step in advance. It calls for trust in motion, not certainty before action. This is unbearable for the flesh, which wants guarantees before commitment. The flesh says, "Show me the outcome, then I will obey." The spirit says, "Obey, and the outcome will be revealed." This reversal terrifies the flesh because it removes its negotiating power. Obedience is frightening because it forces the flesh to confront mortality of identity. The flesh does not merely want to live. It wants continuity of self as it currently exists. Obedience calls for pruning, reshaping, and sometimes complete dismantling of long-held ways of being. This feels like death, even though it is transformation. The flesh cannot distinguish between the two. It equates loss of form with loss of existence. This is why obedience often triggers grief. Even when obedience leads to something better, there is mourning for what is being left behind. The flesh grieves routines, relationships, habits, coping mechanisms, identities, and dreams that once felt essential. Obedience does not dismiss this grief, but the flesh uses it as evidence that obedience is harmful. In reality, grief is simply proof that something real is changing. The flesh fears obedience because obedience exposes how much of its life has been built around avoidance of death. Not physical death, but the death of illusions, attachments, and false securities. The flesh clings to youth, relevance, control, certainty, and self-determination because these things mask impermanence. Obedience strips away these disguises. It confronts the believer with the truth that life is not preserved through control, but through surrender. Another layer of fear emerges because obedience dismantles false power. The flesh believes it is strong because it can resist, endure, and assert itself. Obedience reveals a different kind of strength, the strength to yield. Yielding feels like weakness to the flesh because it removes the ability to fight, defend, or dominate. But yielding to the Spirit is not passivity, it is alignment with a greater authority. The flesh fears this because it loses its position as primary actor. Obedience also threatens the flesh because obedience removes the illusion of independence. The flesh prides itself on self-reliance. It wants to believe that survival depends on personal effort, strategy, and resilience. Obedience reveals dependence as truth, not failure. It teaches that life is sustained, not manufactured. This revelation is humiliating to the flesh because it exposes how much energy has been spent pretending to be self-sufficient. The flesh fears obedience because obedience demands trust in something unseen. Faith is not abstract belief, it is lived reliance. Obedience turns belief into action. When belief remains intellectual, the flesh feels safe. When belief becomes embodied through obedience, the flesh panics because now faith has consequences. Obedience makes belief real, and reality cannot be controlled by the flesh. Another reason obedience feels so threatening is that obedience accelerates separation. Not separation from the world in a physical sense, but separation from certain ways of thinking, relating, and responding. Obedience naturally creates distance between the believer and systems that rely on fear, manipulation, indulgence, and self-centeredness. The flesh fears this separation because it equates separation with abandonment. Many believers resist obedience not because they love disobedience, but because they fear being alone. The flesh thrives on external reinforcement. It wants agreement, validation, and shared justification. Obedience often requires standing without consensus. It demands integrity, even when misunderstood. The flesh fears this solitude because it has learned to measure safety by numbers. Obedience also threatens the flesh because obedience dismantles delayed accountability. The flesh survives by postponing consequences. It convinces the believer that change can happen later, that growth is gradual, and that urgency is unnecessary. Obedience introduces immediacy. It collapses timelines. It brings the future into the present. The flesh fears immediacy because it exposes avoidance. Another deep fear arises because obedience reveals how little the flesh actually trusts God. Many believers trust God conceptually, but rely on the flesh practically. Obedience exposes this gap. When obedience is required, the believer must confront whether trust is real or rhetorical. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it reveals dependency on self rather than faith in the Spirit. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience dismantles cycles of self-pity. The flesh often uses suffering as identity and justification. It says, "Because I have been hurt, I am entitled to protect myself, indulge myself, or withdraw." Obedience does not deny pain, but it refuses to let pain rule. This refusal threatens the flesh because it removes a powerful excuse. Obedience also exposes how often resistance is rooted in fear of freedom. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wants. It is the ability to do what is right without being enslaved by fear or desire. The flesh does not want this kind of freedom because it removes dependency. Obedience trains freedom. It weakens compulsions. It dismantles emotional reflexes. The flesh fears this training because it loses leverage. As obedience continues, the flesh experiences something it has tried to avoid: quiet. Not silence of sound, but silence of inner conflict. The noise of justification, negotiation, and resistance begins to fade. This quiet is deeply unsettling at first because the flesh has learned to exist through noise. But this quiet becomes peace. The flesh fears peace because peace requires nothing from it. Obedience also leads to exposure of spiritual maturity gaps. Many believers know far more than they live. Obedience turns knowledge into responsibility. The flesh fears responsibility because responsibility removes the comfort of ignorance. Once obedience begins, there is no return to unawareness. The flesh fears crossing this threshold because it knows innocence cannot be reclaimed. Ultimately, the flesh fears obedience because obedience leads to surrender, and surrender leads to transformation. Transformation means the old self does not get to remain in charge. The flesh knows that once obedience becomes habitual, its influence will fade. Desires will change, reactions will soften, attachments will loosen, identity will stabilize. The flesh cannot survive in this environment. Yet this is the paradox the flesh cannot see. Obedience does not destroy life, it reveals it. What the flesh calls death is actually release. What it calls loss is actually restoration. What it calls fear is actually invitation. Obedience is not the end of the believer, it is the end of the war. If you have felt deep resistance to obedience, especially when it feels like something inside you is being asked to die, understand that this fear is not a sign you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that something false is being dismantled. Stay faithful. Do not retreat when obedience feels costly. What is being surrendered is not your life, but the illusion that you were meant to control it. If this message has brought clarity to the deepest layers of your inner struggle and helped you understand why obedience feels like such a profound battle, subscribe to the channel so you can continue growing in truth, surrender, and spirit-led freedom.